Good afternoon again. I am Erica Van Rosemellen, as Denise introduced, and I work with EQAO, the Education Quality and Accountability Office here, and I've been asked to rein these folks in our conversation and discussion today. So we really have, and I think it reflected much in what Chris had talked about earlier this morning, that we have seen a real surge in those working in the area, presenting in the area, debating in the area, writing papers and coming to conference presentations around research to practice networks. And looking at the idea of how do we use evidence-informed practice, evidence-informed policy, knowledge mobilization, in the hopes of better understanding and improving policy development and service provision within education. So within our 45 minutes that we have this afternoon, our objective really is to share some of the experiences and some of the thinking around research to practice networks, such as those who are being represented here at the panel, and how they are working towards advancing evidence-based and evidence-informed policies, programs, and practices across the education sector and beyond the education sector, knowing full well that it is not just within education that we have many of these networks, but how we are working collaboratively across other sectors as well. So we have quite a distinct group of panelists here today, really coming from different places in their work within networks, and we'll see how that plays through. So I'm going to introduce everyone just briefly. You do have a little pink sheet of paper in your packages, which really outlines who the panelists are. So I'll just introduce them to my left, the other left, thank you. We have Katina Pollock, who is co-chair of NAIR, which is the Knowledge Network for Applied Educational Research. And NAIR is a collaborative partnership between the Ministry of Education, the University of Toronto, and the University of Western Ontario. Next to Katina, we have Dragna Martinovic from the University of Windsor, and she's representing the SURE Network, which is the School Board University Research Exchange, which is a network of 5 faculties of education and 16 school districts who make up part of the Managing Information for Student Achievement Professional Network Center. Next to Dragna, we have Maria Cantilini-Williams, and she's actually representing a group of researchers from Nipissing University who took on the evaluation of a network, and that's the FACES network, which is the Family and Community Engagement Strategy. And that is a pilot project that was initiated and implemented by the Learning Partnership, which is an early learning network involving families and communities for young families and young children in Durham, Sudbury, and Cornwall. Next, Maria, we have Amanda Cooper. And Amanda has more recently founded the Ripple Network, which is the research informing policy practice and leadership in education, which is housed at Queen's University. And Amanda's work really is focusing on the whole K-12 spectrum. And last but not least, we have Michael Johnny from the University of York, and he's representing Research Impact, which is a pan-Canadian network involving 12 universities from Victoria, British Columbia, all the way to St. John's, Newfoundland. So that's who we have with us today. So I'm going to get us started. So I want to thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to get us started by asking you really to reflect on some of Chris's messages from this morning. Was there something in particular that resonated with you? Something that there was a key message, a concept, an articulation that you walked away with and said, I got to take that back. That is something that's going to help me understand the successes and challenges within my network, or something that I'm going to use to really move the network work that we do or that we are engaged with going forward. So I'm going to open it up. Who's ever going to jump right in, and we'll see where we go.
Well, I'm happy to start off. Firstly, thank you very much, Erica. Thanks for the organizers for the opportunity. I work as a broker at York University which is part of the larger Research Impact Network. I was really impressed and validated by what Dr. Brown had to say about relationships and how important and central they are to effective networking, because For me, from where I sit within the Research Impact Network, relationships are really the currency that drive the value for what we do. So it was very impressive when he talked about issues of trust, even more specific nuanced things like accountability and the learning conversations. I saw the relationship component being embedded.
Maria?
Could I add? Again, thank you, Erica, for the invitation and for being here to represent a team of researchers. The FACES project, and John Howard is here from the Learning Partnership. He was one of the coordinators of this network. And as was mentioned by Dr. Brown this morning, there is a need for a local leader, a champion, and those coordinators in those centers were well respected, were well informed, were passionate about their work, and that made for the success of the network. I would think that, again, as Dr. Brown mentioned, we need opinion formers, opinion transformers, I would add, who do champion the cause. And I would say, again, that Dr. Brown's point resonated and was certainly reflected in the network that we looked at.
I can go next.
Okay.
I was really inspired by his talk, for sure. I found many connections with what we are doing here in Ontario. He was talking about move from professional learning communities to research communities, which was really something that we are trying to do as SURE Network, and also me personally working with local school boards. What I would like to problematize, because we were asked to also add a little bit of debate. He was talking about, he was using metaphor of driving. And he was saying if you want to move from a state of novice to the state of expert, you go that naturally. So that's the idea, that you start by being very conscious about what you're doing, so you have prescribed steps in what you're doing as a researcher maybe, or as a teacher. And then by learning more and by gaining more practice, you move towards something that is more intuitive, and then you become an expert. And I wanted to problematize that, because I consider myself as an expert researcher, but I don't feel like when I start the project, like when I'm driving somewhere, or at least not driving our roads, usual roads. For me, research is problem solving. It is about also developing that open mindset, developing positive attitude, being able to stand critique. Of course, working with others, which is the idea. So I was just thinking, because my goal is to work with teachers as researchers. And that's what we are trying to do in Windsor and in SURE as well. So I'm thinking that being an expert is more a process than a state. You don't stay there as an expert, but every new challenge is a new challenge, is something that is where you have to start from the beginning maybe, or from somewhere. So that's what I was going to put this to our panel.
You want to respond to that?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Just to give you a little context about the Knowledge Network, I also wanted to point out that it's an entire system network. At least that's what we're hoping and we're trying to build. It's a systems network. So in thinking about that, in thinking about being the expert and the driving, and we're constantly learning, I would say as the NAIR research team, there are 3 of us, myself and Carol, and I would say the ministry is the other research partner in this. We have come to places where we are constantly learning. And we think we have things figured out, and a new element comes in. And that comes from being reflective in our practices. And I think that is also what continues to create a network that moves forward. And when I mean moving forward, that depends on what the goal of the network is, whether it's to expand, whether it has particular goals in going forward, or multiple goals, I should say. But I also wanted to talk about thinking about Dr. Brown's presentation this morning. It definitely, relationships resonated with me, but also thinking about some of the smaller, more pragmatic elements of how do we work with practitioners and end users or educators. And that can be quite broad because our network is not necessarily narrowly bounded. So we're not necessarily looking at a school or a group of schools and what's happening in that school. We're talking about networks that cross boundaries, where the relationships are important, but the binding of these relationships is not based on educators in a particular school or educators in a particular school board. We're thinking about relationships and networks that cross different sectors, different stakeholders, and that increases the complexity of our network, and those are the things that we try to work through.
I find that interesting, the other part of that, because you spoke to the idea of the systems, not just the system. So it's not just an education system, but there are multiple systems and how that link works together in terms of building those trusting relationships across systems as well as within the education sector.
And I just wanted to jump in there. And so first, the caveat is my network, which is Ripple, actually studies brokers and brokering and the process of networks. And it does that across research producers, research users, as well as the brokers that mediate those interactions. So I take it from a little bit, I'm interested in how they measure their impact, what does interactions with different stakeholders look like, and all of this was driven from my experiences in a high school classroom as a teacher, when I started realizing that there were different students that I wasn't serving well, I didn't think. And this specific example has to do with relation to autism. And as a teacher, I went and reached out to research, to evidence-based strategies to make my classroom better, to make the lives of those students better, and my experiences as a teacher better. So that's where my passion for knowledge mobilization and brokering came from. It wasn't from a top-down system level. It was from looking at knowledge mobilization and brokering as a way to go out in a systematic way and solve a particular problem of practice. And I think when we talk about end users and talk about teachers and talking about use on the front lines, it has to be driven from there. And I think that's a really critical element. And as I look across networks, the ones that embed users in tangible ways, not at a meeting where you report to them, you report back, but in tangible ways that actually shape the network, that's where you see impact happening.
Can I follow that? Also, Amanda, I'd like to, you brought up a really good point, and that is around the problem. I think I'm also a practitioner. I was a teacher in middle school, and so, we want the best for our students. And so often we are looking at strategies and thinking about, oh, I should apply that, but we're not really clear about what the problem is. And it takes a little bit of practice to pull back from going right into the strategy mode rather than sitting back and saying, what really is going on here and what is the problem? Because if we haven't really figured out what the problem is, the strategies we apply are not going to have the intended outcomes that we want. And so I think that's one of the things when we're thinking about creating networks, funding networks, and thinking about, okay, so we might have to have a product, we might have to have an end goal. I think sometimes we need to pause and think about, maybe we need to really sit around for a while and think about what is the real problem that we're trying to address here. And maybe we can't address the exact problem, but there are pieces of it that we can deal with in the capacity that we have. And then moving forward, we build from there.
I'm going to jump in on that because that leads into where we wanted to go further. But in terms of two questions, really. But the first is the impetus for, and you've started to talk about the development of your networks or the work that you're doing within networks, and the impacts that you've realized or you hope to realize, but particularly around, and I'm going to go back to Chris this morning, but in terms of bringing the research use to life. And so you've started to talk about that, but if you could dig a bit deeper, and how are you actually going to measure or see the impact of bringing that research use to life based on the structure, if you will, or the impetus for the development of your network?
So I'll start off. I mean, our network's 10 years old, and I really believe it took us 10 years to become an overnight success. I mean, I swear to God, I wouldn't go outside my office for the first 3 months when I started working for fear someone would ask me what I do. But the purposefulness of networks is something that always people need to be mindful of. The value proposition. I mean, I'm sure all of us are either involved with or liaise with a network, and we do it purposefully with the assumption and the belief that there is going to be value from that. In our network, we come together regularly, and that does not mean often, but we come together to redefine the value proposition for ourselves and the people we work with. I mean, that notion of impact, we could almost ask ourselves that every year, because our first year when it was just York and the University of Victoria, it's like, well, I hope we can live past the first 3 years of our grant, versus 10 years now where it's like, we've got 12 universities. It would be great to be able to double that within a couple years and have our network start to liaise with high-profile organizations that want to link with researchers. And that could be folks like the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation or the Economic Development Association of Canada that are approaching us now. How can we connect with researchers? And even within Ontario, there have been ministries that say, we want to connect with universities in Ontario. Can you help enable that? So it is this constant inward and outward focus.
Yeah, Dragna?
So our network, Sure Network, as its name says, it's collaboration between universities and school boards. And how we started is we understood, and research is telling us as well, that there is a conception that these two organizations are different in a way and separated, and that one may be more consumer of knowledge and the other may be more creator of knowledge. So we started our network in 2008 as a way of starting that communication between these two different organizations or parts of education system. I also like to look at the education as a system, understanding that there are elementary schools and there are secondary schools and universities and so on. But I really believe that all of us are educators. What keeps us together is that love for education and belief that we could help students. So ultimately, students are what connects Sure. And we meet regularly, at least 4 times a year. We communicate frequently. We organize writing retreats. We organize events. We communicate between each other. And I think we are starting better to understand the nature of each of our organizations. And by doing so, we are able to do more in our own areas of influence.
The other piece I want to add and build in on that is that whole notion, though, when we look at networks, are we always looking at the development of our networks to ensure some sustainability of those networks? But I also think there's a space in the conversation around networks that we establish for a particular reason. And they may be short-term networks, but can have equal impact without having to think about constantly ways that we're going to continue that sustainability, that not all networks need to be sustainable.
Could I add? As Dragana was mentioning, the Sure Network does definitely unite the separate worlds, which are merged, of universities and school boards. The FACES Network was trying to unify the world of school with the world of the community and the community partners who are all involved in working with young children. And it was really interesting to watch the networks form. In each community, the networks were very organic. They developed in a different format. They had similar partners, but they operated in different formats with different processes. They did have the compelling purpose of, again, having the focus on the child. And as we often talk about, it takes a village to raise a child. At the end of this whole process of watching the networks work together, we realized that actually it took a child to raise a village. And because everyone was focused on what's best for young children, they formed these networks that were very powerful. They did sustain themselves. Sometimes they actually became normalized into their fabric of their operations, so that they didn't become an add-on, but it just enhanced and extended. For example, they have the Welcome to Kindergarten program that the Learning Partnership has across Canada. And now, because of the FACES network and the FACES approach of bringing families and community partners together, rather than just the teacher with the kindergarten children, it has become practice to have some of the activities happen off-site, so that it's not always parents coming to the school. Sometimes the teachers go to the library, and that's where they have the activities. They've also had early childhood educators be the ones that co-deliver these sessions. So I think what you're saying is that sometimes sustainability means that actually it's a new norm.
Exactly. Interesting. Yep.
And I have
Amanda?
one thing to add. I've been thinking a lot about research impact, both from an environmental scan, looking at thousands of indicators across public service systems recently, but then what those actually tangibly look like when they're being rolled out, when they're being selected by the organization that's being studied as well. What do they think? What are they interested in knowing? And one of the things that we need more data, of course, across this, but one of the trends I'm noticing looking across many different organizations across Canada, many different networks across Canada, is that the thing, even on a very, very small budget, people seem to be able to have quite a large impact when the element that they're funding with that money is people to go and do that networking. So when the dedicated role is just relationship building, there seems to be greater impact. So the joke is, if a $2 million research report falls in the forest and nobody reads it, does it make us? No, it doesn't, right? So it doesn't matter. You have to commission high quality research, but what I'm noticing across empirically is that where there's that dedicated staff to just go out and do that networking and build those relationships, that's where you seem to get the biggest bang for your buck.
Katina, did you want to add in? And then okay.
Yeah,
Go
well,
ahead. Yeah.
that makes sense because it's about relationships, right? But I was just reading this last night, and it's an article from Oliver Surrett, and his last sentence is, lastly, more research is needed in simple but effective means to evaluate performance. There you go. That's it.
So building, okay, I'm going to build on even further now then, and based on, we had our poll question as well, but what do you see as the role of the current players, if you will, and however you may define those players within these research practice networks? What is that role? What do you see the role in terms of creating the conditions for self-sustaining and self-improving school systems? So switching the role from looking at the sustaining of the network versus the output, and how do we help school systems become self-sustaining and self-improving?
I'll start. Firstly, I thought when Amanda was thinking about research impact for such a long time, I thought she was thinking about us. So I mean, I just have to come clean with that. Our network focuses on a broad array of subjects, education being one of them. So the interesting point to your comment there for me, Eric, is the notion of systems. I think networks that are effective in their meaningful engagement, not token participation, and their ability to look upstream and downstream to see how the nature of their work can affect and inform people, tend to do a really good job. And I mean, to that point, I think school-based networks do a really good job. We've had experience working with the York Region District School Board in the past, and they've come out to pretty much everything we've done, to the point where I'm like, why are you here? And they're like, well, no, this is important because as an educational organization, we're also involved in community development. So, but they are very aware of their role within a system. And I mean, to me, that's the word that's the most critical.
Well, and that becomes then, when you say, why were you here? To them, the network has become habit forming. It is who and what they are and what they do, as opposed to I belong to a network. It is the way that I operate.
if there's anybody from the York Region District School, that was always my indoor voice. I just kind of, I just blurted that out now, but.
Well, I just wanted to ask, because what we're trying to do around knowledge mobilization and around each of these networks is actually incredibly challenging. And I just like to do some audience participation at least one point, and so this is the moment I'm going to grab. How many people, just by a show of hands, know that daily physical activity is good for your health? That there's research evidence to show that? Okay, so if you know that, put up your hand. Okay, so now how many of you actually do it? You don't have to raise your hand for that part. The idea here is we've got a large body of evidence that most people have consensus on. Most people would agree with it. You could probably strap on your shoes and go for a run. You know, there's not a lot of barriers to money, to being able to go and do that. And the idea around habit or changing practice to align with evidence, and this is a pretty, everyone agrees with this evidence, let alone some of the contentious issues in education where there's not agreement on the evidence. So across systems, at a system level, what we're trying to do to transform practice is really, really challenging. So I think we need to also keep that in mind when we're talking about impact, because if you even think about how you apply evidence that you know in your own practice personally, so how difficult is what we're trying to do? It's pretty difficult.
So next year, treadmills at the back of the room.
Back of the room.
Or the front of the room.
Yeah, and Dragna's going to add in on this.
As Amanda was saying, I think it's a changing of a game that we are witnessing right now. The way how we do things as educators, as researchers, is changing. And networking is probably some of the answers that we have right now. I like today's speech about research networks, and I think that's where we are going. Understanding that only together and exchanging information and gaining knowledge together is what counts. I like the idea of network as learning with each other, learning from each other, and learning on behalf of each other, meaning that diversity inside the network is important because that allows of that exchange of understanding. Then, of course, we have to have some sort of common goal or separate goals on which we are working. And then all of us become brokers of knowledge. So whoever is the member of network, they go and they create their own networks, and then they propagate that knowledge. And I think that's the idea of how we work today.
So changing that definition as well. Interesting. Marie?
I would say also there's really a need for tolerance for ambiguity. As much as we all like to know what we're doing next, in my experiences with the FACES network, but also with the SURE network, we had to continually reinvent ourselves and continually adjust and reflect and change our processes and decide how we're going to operate differently. The turnover that happens in any network, the fact that almost every network has other networks that are competing with the same kind of focus or initiative, and also the fact that many times when we're involved in a network, it's not our full-time job. It's on top of other things that we do, and that's what we heard in the evaluation was that it became part of their operations later. And as Dr. Brown mentioned this morning, you need to have control in the first year with a lot of support and a lot of resources, but as time goes on, the network changes itself, and you need to give the network the opportunity to reinvent itself and become maybe a new kind of network.
Well, you go.
Well, and I'm also thinking, we need to also think about what do we mean by a network? And how are networks different from service contracts or research contracts or partnerships? And I think, we've had to really sit down and think about, what does this mean? What is a network, and what are we trying to get here? When is something a network, and when something not a network? And I think for me and for my colleagues that sit around the near table, we really believe that a network has a particular goal, but partnerships can have a particular goal. But it's when those parts come together and they're more than the whole, so that there's some kind of synergy, that people are bringing expertise that from individual stakeholders or groups coming together to move forward. Now, obviously, our networks have some specific parameters. Like in the past, we've had it so that there are researchers connected to our networks, that we have multiple stakeholders. We say educators, so that could be early childhood educators, it could be teachers, could be principals, could be psychologists, speech pathologists. Whoever touches education can be a part of this, but we have some specific expectations around what we expect a network to look like. And that has been a challenge, just trying to formalize, well, what do we mean by network when we're putting it out there? Here, we want you to create a network. Well, we want it to be more than something where somebody goes around and gets other groups to sign a letter to say, yeah, we think it's a great idea, we're going to champion it, and then that's it. We don't see them anymore. But there's actual engagement and sincere engagement, and that there is some kind of structure around decision making, and that there's some formal structures such as formal ways that the networks communicate amongst their participants and their members, but also then how they share. I mean, there are informal networks and there are formal networks, and even with informal networks, there are informal practices. We all know that. And sometimes it's the informal practices that might get us a little further along.
Well, I'm going to build on that, though, because part of what you're talking about, though, is networks being more than a structure, that networks are a way of behaving. And it's more than a partnership as well, in realizing and appreciating and tapping into that behavior, not just something that I attend to. And I was struck also when you mentioned about, we have day jobs as well. But if it becomes a behavior, it should infuse within that day job.
But that's why it's so critical to embed these infrastructure, like beyond networks, things have to be embedded in infrastructure across systems and levels in a way that regardless of the problem that, this year it's math we're focusing on, regardless of what problem arises, that infrastructure in order to go out and reach to researchers and work with people is the same, although the problems are different. And yes, that's going to mean different people at the table for different issues. But building that infrastructure and building these at the organizational level is absolutely critical, both in schools, in ministries, in universities. And I think there's an appetite and the will to do some of that work. But it's hard work, and it takes time, and it takes trust. And you have to work with someone over a number of years before you're really comfortable risk-taking with them. And so I think that building it into the organizational structure is absolutely critical.
I'd say structure and culture.
And culture, right, yeah.
And I think a part of that is thinking, when we think about structure, sometimes, some people default around things like memorandums of understanding, those kinds of things that are structure. But I also think of structure as in people and relationships. And we need to build trusting relationships. Sometimes it's key people who are in organizations that help to move networks along. But we've also come to realize, too, that when I say we, I'm meaning the NAIR team, because we've spent a lot of time problematizing these things, thinking about just not key people, but we might want to call them a cluster or a group of people, because we have found in the past in our experiences is that if we have solely relied on key informants, if they leave, because people do cycle in and out, they change roles, change positions, retire, various kinds of things. Sometimes momentum is lost because there's been an over-reliance on perhaps a key person. And then we have to think about, well, how do we sustain people's motivation? And part of that is having it as a habit, as a part of, a way of working, part of the culture. But other parts of it is also incentivizing for people at different levels. And we have to think, well, what does what does that look like for different people? So in thinking as a researcher, that might be, somebody gets to publish about it. A researcher gets to actually publish something from this. It might be that for teachers, it might be release time. And we were having a conversation, an informal conversation about, we say, release time, that's an easy kind of thing to do, but it's so expensive. So then we're draining on other kinds of resources. But this is one of the things that we are thinking about. How do you motivate and incentivize to continue with that enthusiasm when people get together? Because you know what? It is a long, difficult road to be on at times. because it's about working with different institutions that might have different deadlines, might have different decision-making processes and strategies. And you're also dealing with organizations that have different kinds of culture. And bringing people together and working as a group requires particular kinds of skills.
I know for us, with our first few years, it was just York University and the University of Victoria. And it was great because you could kind of sit across the room like you might with your partner and just say, what do you think about this? And she goes, oh, that's great, let's do that, and off we go. But now our network has 11 partners, and that completely has changed the dynamic for us. And I know context in networks is completely different, but what we've come to realize, and this was something shared by the former CEO of the United Way York region, it's really resonated for me within our network work, is go slow in order to go far. And the takeaway is process matters. And I mean, there have been times where I'm like, hey, I've been doing this for 10 years. I think I think I know what I know, and off I go. And I very nicely get reined in by colleagues. And it's like, well, that's great, Michael, but we haven't been doing this for 10 years. And it's shared ownership. We need to be able to talk about it and understand it, and then we can move on together. I mean, the last thing, for me, the last real takeaway is communicate the heck out of successes. Honest to goodness, do not be ashamed to wave your successes up the flagpole, because it's not just yourself, it's the folks you're working with and the folks you're working for. Almost like a prism when the light is shone in and it kind of reflects out in all kinds of different directions. That's important, and I mean, for me, it took me a while to change my thinking about that, coming from a modest place where it's like, no, we're doing something important. We think we're doing something good. Let's talk about that.
Dregna and then Maria.
Yes, for sure, network, it was certainly very important to have constant support from MISA and also from Ministry of Education. And it's not only because these funds were, we could use the funds to meet and to organize some events maybe, but it is also recognition of our existence and of our importance. And I think that is something that also may sustain some community, be network or partnership. And that's external recognition that you exist and therefore you may be important. So that's one thing. And of course, we were looking for external grants. We were supported by SSHRC, we were supported by CNAIR, and so on. So we are always trying to add, but that constant support is, I think, very important. When we talk about sustainability, I think what government is doing for networks is very important.
Okay, thank you. Maria, and then we're going to have another question.
I was going to just mention the fact that we're looking at research to practice networks, but I would also like to propose that we have practice to research networks and that it goes back and forth, because certainly in my experiences with both SSHRC and FACES, the networks were formed because of good practice, and good practice was maybe in pockets, and what we did then was expand it and normalize it into a broader community, and then conducted research to, again, validate and collect evidence. And just, I guess, going back to the point of the release time that's so expensive, in listening to Dr. Brown speak today, we have often conducted research with our partners in education. I also was a teacher and still am a teacher, and feel that certainly teacher as researcher is an important concept. To always have to give release time seems very expensive, as Katina mentioned. If we could change the paradigm a little bit and planning time became planning/research time, we would have time to be able to engage teachers in teacher research. So some of what I think networks do or communities do is, again, develop and enhance and extend what's already happening.
Thank you.
And
you
validate.
Scooped me on my last question.
Oh, sorry.
Well, that's quite right. It's the way that but my question is actually to the broader audience as well as to the panel. And it's that very thing that we talk frequently about research to practice networks, but what about the practice to research networks? And we have a panel of academic researchers here. We heard from Chris this morning. How would our conversation, what would be the pieces that come forward? Because I know a number of you in the audience as well belong to different networks. Some of you do belong to broader-based community networks that have really percolated from the ground up and have reached out to academics. Some of you have actually maintained those networks as large-scale community networks. So what would be the issues that would percolate up? How would the conversation be different if on this panel we had practitioners and or policymakers reflecting on the value, the successes, and the challenges of networks and the role that they play going forward? So if we have time, we can open it up for a couple of reflections from the audience or from the panel.
I just had one comment about sharing successes or sharing. I think it's really important. We were in a meeting the other day talking about going to scale on a Housing First, the Housing First initiative that's rolling out across Canada. The idea that if we give someone a house before we actually make them meet all these benchmarks of sobriety, all these different things to deserve a house, then that's rolling out kind of across Canada. And we were actually talking about, as they try to go to scale, it's actually really critical. Yes, share successes, but it's even more critical to have safe spaces to share what really didn't work, what really went badly, because some of those lessons, when you're trying to roll out large initiatives, are actually more instructive for the people that are then having to roll it out in their context. So I just wanted to.
Okay, but now back to my real question. So you get to start, Amanda.
Woven there.
Practice to research, what would it look like?
I'll give Amanda a moment. I mean, I think the values would be the same. If these were policy professionals or if these were practitioners, I am convinced that the values that they would share around their network experience and why networks matter to them would probably be the same. I think they're universal, but I think their pain points, the areas in which they get stuck, the frustrations or the opportunities are highly contextual. There, I think you'd see some significant differences around whether it's around resourcing or capacity or what have you. So there could be some differences there, but it may be a little more similar than we realize.
Maria?
I guess I would question that any one of us is either or, either a practitioner or a researcher or a policymaker. It sort of seems like research plus practice includes and does result in policy. And many of us have walked different fields, and so I think that understanding is what we need to proclaim and need to celebrate. And I found too that in working with teachers, they really have lots of wonderful thoughts about what works. And if we could just help them name it, proclaim it, frame it, it really does then become policy and become embedded in our practice. So it's kind of cyclical.
Okay, and I'm going to wrap it up here. One final note, because I think we talk frequently about practitioners and we almost equate them with teachers. Mm-hmm. And I think we also have a lot of researchers who are practitioners within communities, within schools, that we need to reflect on as well. I want to thank you all. Thank you for the audience. Everyone's going to be around for the course of the conference, so if you want to hear more, but also know that they have, and then we're going to have a question in a minute, that they have their space out in the research exhibit as well, where you can connect with them as well. And we've got one question from the audience, and then we'll close her down. Wilfred.
I don't have a question.
Okay.
I have just observation and just a feedback, a mix of that. I'm the first time here, and I was really fascinated listening to you. And I compared everything what you said with things I heard in Vienna or in Berlin or in Heidelberg or in Zurich. I just transformed it in my background environment. And I felt that it's completely the same. We have the same topics, the same dynamics. And what I found out, because I work a lot with networks and create networks, and I'm part of networks, and I love networks. And at the same time, networks are sometimes really a pain. Absolutely. And the question is how we can create a quality of interaction which is really something which is a difference, which makes a difference. Yeah? And this is, has to create an impact, not only at the end of a research, but in the moment. If someone is there to present something which is remarkable, this is a value. If there's a communication which is different from what you have in everyday life, it's a remarkable. The quality of interaction, the quality of communication is really a crucial point in my experience, and I felt that it's nearly the same. And I want to thank you to listen to you and to feel very close to your experience as a stranger in the field here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.